I have told this story maybe 100 times in my life, and every time I get to the end of it, somebody asks me the same question. They ask me how I knew. How a drifting cattle hand with dirt under his nails and no schooling to speak of knew the right thing to do for a woman like Ruth Doyle. And every time I give them the same answer. I didn't know anything. I just kept my mouth shut long enough to learn. It was the back end of autumn when I rode into Hawthorne Valley, and the rain had already settled in for the season the way it does in that country, soft and gray and endless, soaking the pines until the whole valley smelled like wet bark and wood smoke. I had come up out of the dry cattle country looking for winter work, and Hawthorne was the kind of place that swallowed men like me without a ripple. A river ran cold and wide along the eastern edge of it, fed by snow somewhere up high, and the cattle ranches and timber camps spread out from the water like fingers off a hand. I'd been told in the last town over that a widow up the North Road needed a hired man and couldn't get one to stay, and I figured that was as good a lead as any. A man who can't afford to be choosy goes where the work nobody wants is waiting. The Doyle place sat at the end of a rutted lane lined with hawthorn hedges gone wild, and the first thing I noticed was that it was dying. Not dead yet, but dying, the way a fire dies down to coals that still glow but have stopped throwing heat. The fences leaned. The barn roof sagged on one side. There were good cattle in the field, a dozen head, but the field needed clearing and the woodpile was low for the season coming. It was the kind of place that told you a story before anyone said a word. Somebody here was working harder than one body could work, and still losing ground. Ruth Doyle came out onto the porch before I'd even tied my horse. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pinned back hard and a face that had decided a long time ago not to give anything away. She held a rifle, not pointed at me, just held, the way you hold a thing you want a stranger to notice. "If you're from Crane," she said, "you can turn that animal around right now." "I don't know any Crane," I said. "I heard you needed a hand for the winter. Name's Caleb Mercer." She studied me a long moment, and I let her. I've learned that the worst thing you can do with a watchful person is rush them. After a while she lowered the rifle, though she didn't set it down. "I can pay you in board and a little money," she said. "Not much money. The work is hard and there's a lot of it. Most men last a week." She paused and something passed behind her eyes, quick as a fish under water. "I'll tell you now so there's no confusion. I want a hired hand. I don't want company and I don't want a man underfoot in my house making conversation. You sleep in the loft over the lean-to. You take your meals on the porch unless it's freezing. We clear." "Clear," I said. And that was how I came to work for Ruth Doyle, and how I came to spend that first week noticing the one thing she did not want noticed. Because by the second day I had seen it, plain as the rain. There was a hitch in the way she moved. When she thought no one was watching, she'd put a hand flat against her right hip and stand still a moment, the way a man stands still when his old wound is talking to him before a storm. When she climbed the porch steps, she led with the same foot every time and brought the other up after, slow, careful. And there were moments, just flickers, when she'd reach for a thing too quick and her whole face would go white and tight around the mouth, and then smooth over again like still water. She hid it well. She'd been hiding it a long time, I could tell. But a man who has spent his life watching cattle for the first sign of lameness learns to see what a body is trying not to show. I saw it. And I said nothing. It wasn't my business, and besides, I had already figured out that the fastest way to lose this job was to make Ruth Doyle feel seen in a way she hadn't allowed. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Prout, who told me about the rest of it. She came by the third day with a basket of eggs, a wide, soft woman with sharp little eyes who clearly considered the gathering and dispensing of news to be her chief occupation in life. She caught me at the fence line and unloaded all of it before I could so much as say good morning. "You're the new one," she said. "Lord, but you've got a job ahead of you. That girl, stubborn as a fence post. You know about the debt, of course." I said I didn't. Mrs. Prout's eyes lit up like I'd handed her a present. "Silas Crane holds paper on this farm, has for 2 years since before her husband passed. Crane's been buying up half the valley, real quiet, real polite, the way a thing eats you from the inside. He wants the Doyle land for the river frontage. Good water rights, you understand. And Ruth, well, here she leaned in and her voice dropped to the kind of whisper that's meant to be heard. There's something not right about her, you know, something she won't speak of. Folks say there's a shame on her. Why else would a young widow run off every suitor in the valley? Why won't she let a soul close? My own opinion, there's a past there. Something she did or something done to her she's too ashamed to own. A woman doesn't go that hard and that silent over nothing. I thanked her for the eggs and went back to my fence, and I thought about that word she'd used, shame. The whole valley had decided Ruth Doyle was hiding a shame, and they'd built it into something dark and secret, a scandal with no name. And I thought about the hand flat against her hip, the careful foot on the stairs, the white tight mouth, and I held my peace because I didn't yet know what I knew. I only knew the valley was wrong about the shape of it. They were looking for something she'd done. I was beginning to think it was something that had been done to her body, and that's a different kind of secret entirely. Silas Crane came that same week, and he was nothing like I expected. I'd built him up in my mind as some hard-eyed land baron, but he rolled up the lane in a clean buggy wearing a good coat, a slim, handsome man with gray at his temples and a smile that never reached past his teeth. He had manners like a Sunday preacher. He called Ruth Mrs. Doyle with a little bow, and he stood on the porch she would not let me eat on, hat in hand, talking soft and reasonable about how he only wanted to help. About how a woman alone shouldn't have to carry such a burden. About how the note was coming due in the spring, and wouldn't it be a mercy, really, to let it all go and start fresh somewhere the work wasn't so cruel on a person. He said that last part looking right at her hip, just for a second, and I saw Ruth go rigid, and I understood that he knew. Crane knew about the hurt she hid. And he was the only one in the valley who did, and he meant to use it. "I'm not selling, Mr. Crane," Ruth said, and her voice was steady, but I was close enough to see her hand trembling against the porch rail. "Of course not," he said warmly. "Not today, but spring comes for everyone, Mrs. Doyle, even the proud, especially the proud." He set his hat on his head and smiled that smile that died at the teeth. "Do think about your comfort. A person can only pretend so long that nothing's wrong before the truth gets out and embarrasses them in front of everybody. Better to choose the time yourself, I always say." And he drove off, leaving that hanging in the wet air like the smell after lightning. I went back to splitting wood, and I split a great deal more of it than I needed to, because I had to do something with what was rising up in me, which was a clean, cold anger I hadn't felt in years. The weeks that followed settled into a hard rhythm. Ruth ran that farm like a sergeant runs a company, and she ran herself harder than she ran me. She was up before light and working past dark, and she would not let me take the things from her that I could see cost her the most. The morning I tried to carry the full milk pails up from the field for her, she near took my head off. "I can carry my own pails, Mr. Mercer. You were hired to mind cattle, not to mind me." So I learned. I learned to do the thing she needed without ever making it look like I'd noticed she needed it. I'd find a reason to already be walking up from the field with my own load, so it was natural to take a pail. I'd fix the bottom porch step so it sat a little lower and a little wider, and when she gave me a look I said the old one had been rotten, which was half true. I built a stool for the milking that put her at an easier angle and left it in the barn without a word, and when she found it she didn't thank me but she used it, and she didn't make me take it out. That was Ruth's way of saying thank you, I came to learn. She'd let a kindness stay. In the evenings I had nothing to do, so I took up whittling, which I had no gift for whatsoever. I'd sit in the loft with a candle and a knife and a chunk of soft cedar, and I'd make little animals, and they were, without exception, terrible. The first one was meant to be a horse, and Ruth, when she saw it sitting on the porch rail, asked me with a perfectly straight face why I'd carved a turnip with legs. I made a dog next, and Mrs. Prout declared it the finest possum she'd ever seen. But I kept at it, and I kept setting them on the porch rail, one by one, a whole little herd of misshapen creatures, and I noticed Ruth never threw a single one away. They lined up there in the rain, my ugly little animals, and somewhere along the way they became a thing between us that didn't need explaining. She'd come out in the morning and look at the newest one and shake her head and say something dry about my prospects as an artist, and I'd say something back. And for just a moment the hardness in her would ease and I'd catch the edge of a smile she was too stubborn to finish. It wasn't much, but out there in all that gray rain, it was a small fire, and I tended it careful. The fire that mattered came in December, and it was not a small one. I woke in the loft to the smell of it first, that wrong sharp smell that pulls a man out of sleep faster than any noise. The barn was burning. I never did learn for certain how it started, whether it was a lantern knocked over by a beast or a coal carried on the wind or something cranes doing, though I had my suspicions about that last, and so did the sheriff later. All I knew that night was that I came down the ladder into a world gone orange and roaring, and the whole east side of the barn was a wall of flame, and the cattle were screaming inside. Ruth was already there. She'd come out of the house in her nightclothes with a shawl thrown over her, and she was hauling the big door open against the heat, and I shouted at her to get back, that it was too far gone, and she didn't even turn her head. "The cattle," she yelled. "I'm not leaving them. They're all I've got." And she went in. I went in after her. The smoke was a living thing in there, and the heat pressed on you like a hand, and we worked in it half blind, slapping the panicked animals toward the door, dragging on halters, getting kicked and shoved and stepped on. We got them out, one by one, all 12 head, and it should have killed us both, but it didn't. The last steer broke for the door, and I turned to follow it, and Ruth wasn't beside me anymore. She'd gone down. She was on the ground in the straw at the back of the barn where the smoke was worst, and a burning beam had come off the wall and pinned the edge of her shawl, and she was pulling at it, but she couldn't get up. She couldn't get her legs under her, and in the orange light I saw her face, and it wasn't fear I saw there. It was something worse. It was shame. Even then, even pinned in a burning barn, the thing on Ruth Doyle's face was the horror of being seen unable. I got the beam off her shawl, and I got my arms under her, and I lifted her, and that was when I felt how wrong her right side was, how the hip didn't move the way a hip should, how she cried out in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. I carried her out into the wet night and laid her down on the cold grass well clear of the heat, and she was gasping and clutching at her side and weeping, and the weeping was not about the pain. I knew that even then. "Now you know," she said when she could talk. The barn was roaring behind us, and the rain was coming down, and her face was streaked with soot and tears. "Now you know I'm broken. Go on and say it." And here is the thing I did, and it is the only wise thing I think I did in that whole season, and I didn't even know it was wise. I didn't say anything at all about her hip. I took off my coat and I put it over her, and I said, "We saved every last one of them, 12 head. You hear me, Ruth? Not one lost. You did that." And I sat down beside her in the rain, and I watched the barn burn, and I let her be, and I did not look at her side, and I did not ask her one single question. She told me 3 nights later, on her own. That was the whole of it, you see, that was everything. The barn was a ruin, and we'd moved the cattle into the field under a lean-to I rigged from what we could save, and we were both worn down to the bone. It was raining, as it always was, and she'd let me eat inside that night for the first time, by the kitchen stove, on account of the cold. We didn't say much over the food. And then when the plates were cleared, she stayed sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup gone cold, and she started talking, looking at the wall and not at me. "It was a wagon," she said. "6 years ago. The team spooked on the river road, and the wagon went over, and I went under it. Crushed my hip. The doctor in those days, he wasn't much, and it didn't set right, and it never will now. Some days I can hardly feel it. Some days I can't stand and I have to crawl, and I lie on the floor of my own house and crawl like an animal where nobody can see." Her voice was flat and steady, the way a person's voice goes when they've rehearsed a thing in their own head 1,000 times and never once said it out loud. My husband stood by me. He wasn't much of a man, but he stood by me, and then he died, and after him there were men who came courting the farm and made like they were courting me. And I let one of them close once. Caleb, I let one of them close. And when he understood what I was, when he saw me try to get up off the ground one morning, he looked at me the way you look at a lame horse you're deciding whether to shoot. And he left. And he told it around the valley. Not the truth. He was too cowardly for the truth. He just let folks believe there was something wrong with me they couldn't name, something shameful. She finally looked at me. Do you know what it is to have a whole town decide you're hiding a sin, when all you're hiding is that it hurts to live in your own body? I'd rather they thought me wicked than weak. A wicked woman is still strong. A weak one is just a burden waiting to be set down. I sat with that a long time. I have never been a man of fast words, and I didn't try to be one then. And when I did speak, I didn't tell her she was wrong, because telling a person their pain is wrong is just one more way of not listening to it. I had a horse once, I said. Best cow pony I ever rode, took a bad step in a gopher hole and broke down in the off hind. Wouldn't ever run flat out again. Owner before me would have shot her. I bought her for near nothing because she was worth near nothing to a man who only counts what an animal can do at a dead run. I turned my cup in my hands. I rode that mare 9 more years. She could read a steer's mind. She could cut a calf out of a herd like she was born knowing how. There wasn't a sound animal in the territory I'd have traded her for, and the only man who ever called her broken was the one too stupid to see what she actually was. I looked up. You're not a lame horse, Ruth, but that fool who left you, he was the same kind of stupid. He saw a thing you couldn't do and went blind to everything you could. That's not your shame to carry. It was his. She didn't answer that, but she put her face in her hands and her shoulders shook, and I sat there and let her, and didn't reach for her and didn't try to fix it, because some things you can't fix and shouldn't try. You can only sit beside them so the person isn't alone in it. After a while she got herself back, and she wiped her face, and she said in a voice that was almost steady, "You make a terrible turnip horse, Caleb Mercer." And I knew then that something had turned over between us that wasn't going to turn back. After that the work between us changed, though to anybody watching it might have looked the same. I built a chair for the kitchen that sat lower and held her right, with arms she could push up against, and this time she didn't make me pretend the old one was rotten. She just sat in it. I rigged a stick with a hook so she could pull the milking stool to her without bending. On the bad days, the days she couldn't stand, she'd send word out to the loft with a knock on the wall we worked out between us, and I'd see to the morning chores alone and she'd not have to say a word about why. And the strangest thing happened, which was that as she stopped spending all her strength on hiding, she had more of it for living. She laughed more. She came out to look at my ugly animals and started telling me what to carve next, demanding a proper cow, and when I made one and it came out looking like a sad melted candle, she laughed so hard she had to hold the rail. The valley noticed. Mrs. Prout noticed first, of course, and told everyone that the widow Doyle had gone soft and happy, and for once the gossip was kind. Folks who'd kept their distance for years on account of a shame that was never there started stopping by, and Ruth, slow and careful, started letting them. But Sela's Crane noticed too, and a man like Crane doesn't want the people he's hunting to grow happy and strong. Happy, strong people are hard to drive off their land. He came in the new year, and this time he didn't bring his polite smile. He brought a paper and the sheriff and half a dozen men from town who owed him money or favors, and he made sure to come on a market Saturday when the road was full of people who'd see it. He stood in Ruth's yard and he raised his voice so the whole road could hear, and he said the note was due, and that he was prepared to be merciful, and then he said the thing he'd been holding all along, the thing he thought would finish her. "And let's be honest, friends," he called out, turning to the gathering crowd, playing to them. "We all know Mrs. Doyle can't work this land. We've all wondered, haven't we, what she's been hiding up here all these years? Well, I'll tell you, because somebody ought to, out of plain Christian concern. The woman's a cripple, has been for years. Can't stand half the days God sends. She's been deceiving every one of you, letting you think she's something she's not, too proud and too ashamed to admit she's not fit to hold a farm. I'm only saying what's kind to say. Better she sells now, with what little dignity." That's enough. It was Ruth. She'd come down off the porch, slow, careful, leading with her good foot the way she always did, and she walked out into the middle of that yard where every soul on the road could see her. And she stopped, and she stood, and she did the bravest thing I have ever seen a human being do. She told the truth he'd been threatening her with herself, out loud in front of everyone, and in doing it she took the whole weapon right out of his hand. "He's right," she said, and her voice carried clear across the yard. "About one thing. 6 years ago a wagon crushed my hip and it never healed. Some days I can't stand. Some days I crawl. I've hidden it because I was ashamed, because I thought if you all knew you'd see a burden instead of a woman." She looked around the crowd at face after face, and she did not flinch from a single one. "Well, now you know. And here's the rest of it, since Mr. Crane's so fond of honesty all of a sudden. In 3 days that barn burned to the ground. I went into the fire on a hip that doesn't work, and I brought out 12 head of cattle, every one of them, and they're standing in that field right now. Ask any rancher in this valley what that's worth. I've kept this farm alive for 2 years that should have killed it, alone in pain every single day. So you can call me a cripple, Silas Crane. You go ahead. But don't you dare call me unfit. There's not a sound-bodied man here who's outworked me, and you know it." The yard was dead silent. And then old Tom Harlan, who ran the biggest spread on the South Fork and whose word was law in matters of land and cattle, spat in the dust and said, loud, "She's not wrong, Crane. I've watched that field 2 years. Anybody could have told you the woman works like 3 men. And another voice took it up, and another, and the thing Crane had built, the dark, nameless shame he'd been feeding on, just came apart in front of him, because you cannot shame a person who has already told the truth about herself. There's nothing left to threaten. I stepped up beside Ruth then, and I didn't say a word. I just stood there, and so did Mrs. Prout, and so did Tom Harlan. And the sheriff looked at the way the whole road had turned and quietly took the paper out of Crane's hand and said maybe they ought to discuss the note down at the bank like civilized men, on Monday, with witnesses. The note got settled in the end. Tom Harlan and 2 other ranchers, ashamed they'd believed the gossip all those years, went in together and bought up Ruth's debt from Crane at a price he couldn't refuse without showing the whole valley what he really was, and they let Ruth pay it back to them slow, in beef, on terms a fair person could meet. Crane sold out and left the valley inside the year. A man whose only tool is other people's shame finds he has nothing to dig with once they've set it down. I married Ruth Doyle the next spring, when the hawthorn was in bloom along that wild lane, and I will tell you the truth. I did not ask her right for a long while because I was afraid she'd think I felt sorry for her, and pity was the one thing she'd never forgive. But she figured me out, the way she figured everything out. She came out onto the porch one evening where my whole crooked herd of animals stood in a row on the rail, dozens of them by then, and she picked up the very first one, the turnip with legs that was meant to be a horse, and she turned it over in her hands and she said, "You know, Caleb, you've been leaving these out here for 2 years now, and not once have you asked me for a thing in return." And I said no, I supposed I hadn't. And she said, "Why is that?" And I said, because I figured if a thing was worth having, it'd come to me when it was ready and not before, and a man only ruins it by grabbing. And she looked at me a long moment with those eyes that didn't miss anything, and she said, "I'm ready." And that was how I came to be married. No grand speech, just a woman holding a wooden turnip telling a fool he could stop waiting. We had a long life on that farm. Ruth and I, her hip never did get better. And there were bad days right to the end. Days she crawled and days I carried her. And neither of us was ever ashamed of it again. Because shame can't live in a house where the truth's already comfortable. We raised cattle and we raised 2 children and the children raised children. And that lane is still in the family to this day. The hawthorn's still gone wild along it. Folks still ask me, the few of them old enough to remember, how I knew the right thing to do for a woman like that. And I still tell them the truth, which disappoints them, because they want a story about a hero who charged in and fixed everything. I didn't fix anything. Ruth fixed it herself in her own time, the day she walked out into that yard and said the words out loud. All I ever did was wait beside her secret without trying to pull it out of her, and build her a lower step and a better chair, and leave a row of ugly little animals on a rail where she could see them every morning and know that somebody in the world was glad she was alive exactly as she was. That's the whole of it. You don't earn a person's trust by breaking down the door they're holding shut. You earn it by sitting down on the porch outside it and staying there in the rain if you have to, until the day they decide on their own to open it. And then you don't say a word about how long it took. You just step inside out of the weather and you're home.